Bank of America's acquisition of Countrywide Financial, a deal so disastrous that it was quoted as the worst deal in the history of American finance. In early 2008, Bank of America agreed to buy the mortgage lender for $4 billion, a fraction of the $22 billion value it had just a year earlier. What an absolute bargain for some AAA high-quality mortgage cash flow. Oh. Jokes aside, when Bank of America made the purchase, they already knew Countrywide was in trouble. The housing market was already collapsing, and there was already a huge rise in people missing their mortgage payments. But Bank of America thought that the deal was good enough that they could eventually turn it around. They'd already sunk $2 billion into the lender to keep it alive before the deal closed. And boy, did they wish that that was the last of it. Instead, Countrywide became a legal liability black hole. It turned out that the loan book was filled with fraudulent applications and inflated home appraisals, which, as any good lender would do, were bundled into mortgage-backed securities and sold to investors, making it, and therefore Bank of America, a lawsuit magnet. Less than a year after the buyout, they faced a $10 billion lawsuit against insurance firm AIG, where about half the damages being sought were related to mortgages that Countrywide had bundled and sold. They faced a suit from the Federal Housing Finance Agency, which Bloomberg puts in the ballpark of $6 billion, and an $8.5 billion settlement with Bank of New York Mellon Corp, just to name a few. By 2013, the LA Times reported that Bank of America had taken a $50 billion hit from losses in loans and foreclosures, lawsuit settlements, and related expenses, all stemming from its purchase of Countrywide. And a year later, the US Justice Department slapped them with a $16 billion settlement. Shockingly, this isn't the biggest corporate buyout loss in history. In fact, it doesn't even come close to it, but I'll get to that story a little bit later. First, let's take a trip back to the 1990s. The decade defined by the internet revolution was also a period filled with lots and lots of terrible takeover deals. In 1991, AT&T acquired NCR Corp for $7.5 billion, and after injecting a few more billion, gave up and spun NRC off for just $3.4 billion. Japanese consumer electronics manufacturer Matsushita, ironic name, acquired MCA and Universal Studios for $6.1 billion before selling an 80% stake at a multi-billion-dollar loss. But there's another corporate misfire from the 90s that is just embarrassing. Quaker Oats' $1.7 billion purchase of Snapple, which Bloomberg correctly identifies as surely one of the decade's worst acquisitions. In the early 90s, Snapple was one of the hottest beverage brands in the US market. In 91, the three founders sold 70% of the business to Thomas H. Lee at a valuation of just $140 million. This was a bargain, considering the company was already doing $100 million in sales from their ready-to-drink tea and juice product lines. In 1992, still under the management of the founders, Snapple launched a string of unique advertising campaigns. While low budget and very corny, the campaigns contributed to the cult-like following that the brand was developing. And just 2 more years later, Lee inked a deal to sell the whole company to Quaker Oats for $1.7 billion. If Quaker had just left Snapple to continue as it had been, this takeover wouldn't be in this video. Instead, they destroyed 2 decades of brand value in just 27 months. Quaker owned the wildly successful Gatorade brand, and arrogantly believed they should distribute and market Snapple the same way. They cut ties with many independent distributors Snapple had long relations with, and shifted to mass market channels like box retail and supermarket chains. But instead of this boosting sales, they collapsed, dropping 15% compared to the previous year. Only after the buyout did Quaker realize they weren't very good at managing independent distributor channels. They also stopped the quirky, low-budget commercials and tried to reposition Snapple as a health drink brand, which made the whole brand's identity confusing. And in 1997, Quaker finally threw in the towel, selling Snapple at a $1.4 billion loss. They effectively woke up and decided to set fire to $50 million every month for 2 years. Now, this wouldn't be a very good corporate takeover video without mentioning the horrific terms of the YahooBroadcast.com one. The deal that rocketed Mark Cuban to the billionaires club because because Yahoo's CEO was drunk and put the decimal point in the wrong place. But Cuban actually isn't the only Shark Tank host who got their start through a ridiculously one-sided buyout. Kevin O'Leary got rich in a very similar way, a deal Businessweek called one of the worst deals of all time. He started SoftKey in 1986, distributing freeware and shareware game software on CD-ROMs. These are basically like demo versions of games, and by 1994, among other things, they'd expanded to distribute edutainment game discs. In Q1 of that year, they did $34.5 million in sales and kept $6.6 million as profit. With the cash flows, Mr. Wonderful and his other business partners went on a buying spree, and among the many acquisitions was that of The Learning Company in 1995. They sold education software that taught subjects like maths and science to children. After the acquisition, O'Leary rebranded the entire business under the Learning Company name. But while sales surged to over $800 million, growth was being fueled by acquisitions, while the underlying business was rapidly becoming obsolete. Fortunately for Mr. Wonderful, Mattel couldn't figure that out. In 1999, the giant global toy maker decided they needed educational tech to modernize their empire, paying $3.6 billion to acquire the firm that O'Leary had a share in. He didn't own the whole business, but he did walk away with millions. And Mattel's mistake was realized instantly. The Learning Company began taking huge losses within weeks of the deal closing. And before a year had passed, Mattel had lost $1 billion. Unsurprisingly, their CEO was forced to resign, and the Learning Company was sold 3 months later for under $30 million. Somehow, Mark Cuban's deal, which closed that same year, was so much worse. Cuban, along with Todd Wagner, invested into a little internet startup company called AudioNet. The site offered streamed coverage of hundreds of radio and television stations, and Cuban envisioned a future where all kinds of media would be streamed online. That sounds kind of trivial today, but in 1995, with everyone still running on dial-up internet, it was wishful thinking. Cuban was very early, but he wasn't wrong. Unfortunately, as the famous saying goes,
"It's the same thing. It's the same thing, Mike."
Internet speeds wouldn't become fast enough for consistent quality streaming until the early 2000s. But that didn't mean they couldn't capitalize on the growing internet euphoria. In 1998, during the height of the internet bubble, AudioNet was rebranded as Broadcast.com. Putting .com in your company's name was like a cheat code for attracting blind investment. Just a year later, it was announced that Yahoo had agreed to buy the company for $5.6 billion worth of stock. There's no way you can even try to rationalize that price. Broadcast.com was deeply unprofitable and was doing just $20 million in sales. The site had about 9 million visits a month, but only 1 million of those were actually new users to Yahoo. So Yahoo was paying like $5,000 per user. I love this quote from the 1999 Times article. If they don't buy, their market value will lose $5 billion over time. Boy, does Yahoo wish that it was only $5 billion. Over the following 2 years, the stock dropped more than 95%, losing over $100 billion in value. Broadcast.com specifically was never even integrated into Yahoo services. They were just actually burning money. And Cuban knew that he'd basically scammed Yahoo because instead of keeping his share of the Yahoo stock, he used derivatives to pull the cash out immediately. And at last, that brings us to the absolute worst business deal of all time, simply by causing the biggest loss in value by a large margin. In 2000, again at the peak of the dot-com bubble, two corporate giants announced a historic merger. AOL would acquire Time Warner for $165 billion. AOL was the leading internet company at the time, and Time Warner was a media titan. CNN, HBO, Warner Brothers, and Time Magazine. What was crazy about this deal was the fact AOL was the one buying Time Warner, and not the other way around. AOL had revenues of just $5.2 billion, a fraction of the $27.7 billion produced by Time Warner. But because this was the year 2000, the stock market was valuing AOL as the bigger company.
80% of the cash flow of this combined company will come from your company, and yet your shareholders will own only 45%. Why were you willing to sign off on a deal?
Oh, well, pretty clearly, if you looked at last Friday, the market cap of AOL was twice the size of Time Warner.
And stupidly, Time Warner's CEO agreed, giving AOL shareholders 55% of the newly merged company. If it isn't obvious yet, AOL's stock price was dramatically